Uh, I will talk for about an hour and then I'll edit it this afternoon and put it up by tonight, I think. Okay.
Actually, Mitt, I don't know if we are live right now.
I'm sorry, you say something?
Well, I was going to say that my current main activity is actually the Healthy Planet Action
Oh,
Coalition.
yeah, I know that. And,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
I mean, you and I could mention that, but of course that's not what we're really
Sure,
going to talk
sure.
about.
I just, yeah.
Yeah, so I think it's worth
As
mentioning.
I have my new background and so forth.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Well, I
nice.
appreciate
I'm
that.
coming
And
out from outer space here.
Yeah,
yeah,
looks
well,
good.
we could have, certainly we could have plenty of conversation on that topic. In fact, we do every Monday practically. I have somebody talking about some aspect of climate repair or geoengineering. I'm told don't even use that word. Anyway, we're live now, and so I should get down to business instead of talking about all these things. Am I live? It says so. They
Yeah.
moved all these informational things. Yes, it says we're live. Okay, let's get going, shall I? And I'll trim all this later, this blather. Okay, here we go. Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. Today we're going to talk about a big social issue, and it's something that environmentalists and economists talk about all the time. I don't know enough to really participate in the conversation very well, but I've got two economists who are very interested in climate repair and climate growth and economics. So we're going to explore the relationship. I guess the real question is, can we have economic growth, assuming that we even want it, which is debatable, but can we have economic growth and not have increasing carbon emissions? Could we have a decrease in carbon emissions and still have economic growth? It's a very important question I want to put to these folks. Okay, I'm going to mention Peter Victor first because he came first a few minutes ago. And Peter Victor is a professor emeritus, York University. He was in the faculty of environmental and energy change. Is that what you called it? Peter, what's the department called? Or
Well, it's the
interdisciplinary?
faculty is now called the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change. But
Yeah,
when I was there, it was called the Faculty of Environmental Studies. They've since changed the name.
yeah. I don't know why, but that's okay. It's all right with me if you're happy with it. So anyway, he's retired, but very busy man. And Ron Bayman is somebody that I sort of bump into online more often. He is also a retired or an emeritus economist, an associate professor of economics at Benedictine University near Chicago. But he and I bump into each other quite a bit on a listserv, or it's not called that anymore, but these things where webinars where people get together. There's something called the Healthy Planet Action Coalition, which he's very engaged with, and which actually it tends to be a little bit more technical than I can digest. So they talk in, use chemical terms and measurement, units of measurement that I have no idea what it means. So I don't tune in as much as I would like to, given the fact that what they're doing is really important, and I believe in what they're doing. So we're not going to talk about Ron's and my preoccupation with climate repair today, but we're going to talk about something very fundamental to it, which is that if you want to have climate repair and you want to have lower carbon emissions, then you got to look at the economic implications of doing that. And there are many disagreements about whether you can decouple these two phenomena. If you could make economic growth continue while you reduce or almost eliminate your carbon emissions. And that is, really what we want to address. Peter Victor has a long history of writing an argument in favor of slowing, or I don't think you want to say halting economic growth, but maybe you want to do that. I think you want to, Peter, launch us, and you guys can interrupt each other and just don't try to be polite. But I think Peter could help us by giving a, like a quick overview of what that conversation is about, which is very much connected with what we're talking about today. So, Peter, what is your research and why are you an important man?
Well, I'll answer the first part of that question. I'll let others judge the second part. Well, I've been interested in the relationship between the economy and the environment ever since I was a graduate student at UBC over 50 years ago. My PhD thesis was to develop a methodology for estimating the relationship between people's consumption in the economy and all of the requirements from nature to service that consumption. My career took me through academia, government, consulting, and back to academia. And come about the year 2000, I was approached by my old PhD supervisor saying, Peter, you remember those discussions we had about economic growth and its limits? We should pick that up again. So we did together, and we wrote some papers. And in 2008, I wrote a book called Managing Without Growth, Slower by Design, Not Disaster. And what I was interested in that book was, what would it mean for economies like the ones we're used to living in Canada here and runs down in the US, if the economies were no longer growing? Because we were convinced, I think, that economic growth over the long term was incompatible with a reduction in the impact humans are making on the biosphere. And the situation has only got worse since 2008. And so now we talk about exceeding planetary boundaries, 9 of which have been identified, 6 of which are being now already exceeded. Of course, climate change is one of those. We're putting excessive amounts of carbon and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, causing climate change, frankly, more rapidly than only a few years ago the experts were anticipating. And so the term I now use is overshoot. I'm not the only one who uses this, that we are in planetary overshoot, overshot the capacity of the planet to support 8 billion plus humans. And so economic growth is a problem for us because historically it has almost always been coupled with an expansion in the materials we require to take from the planet to produce the goods that we have, and the waste that we put back into the environment as a result of that. And one important component of those wastes is carbon dioxide. And so the question that you were raising about whether we can decouple economic growth and expansion in the goods and services produced and consumed in the economy from the increase in greenhouse gases and carbon in particular is a very important one. I won't perhaps go on any further, but I do certainly have a lot to say about the different meanings of decoupling and what the evidence shows and what it might mean if you wish to go that route to try to decouple in a very fundamental way from economic growth.
Okay, let me make a stab at what my own assumption is, and correct me if I'm wrong. My guess is that inference somehow that if your answer is no, you cannot decouple economic growth. Inevitably, if there's economic growth, you're going to have high carbon emissions. If the answer is no, you can't, then the only solution is stop growing. And that means there are real challenges especially for poor countries. People will not, they will suffer for sure. And the rest of us probably won't like it, but we will maybe get along, but that there are going to be implications there. The alternative is, if you do believe that you can separate the two, that you can have economic growth without increasing, or even while you're decreasing carbon emissions, then your policy is going to be something called green growth, that people are talking about ways in which you could change from one, various components of the economy could be shifted around so that we do different things and continue to grow, but nevertheless in ways that we won't be living quite the way we are now, but it might be very pleasant and even better. Now, is my assumption right about those are the two real alternatives?
It's more complicated than that. Let me define decoupling somewhat, because it's not a term that only has one meaning. We can talk about what's called relative decoupling, which means that the carbon emissions per dollar of output declines. The problem with just having relative decoupling is if the total amount of output rises, you can be improving or reducing emissions per dollar, but if the number of dollars increases, the magnitude of your economy measured in dollars, then total emissions can keep rising. So some people will say, look, we've had decoupling, and yet ignore the fact that if it's only relative decoupling, it's not solving the problem, it's making it worse. Then we can have absolute decoupling. With absolute decoupling, I'm sorry if this sounds too technical, but we can't avoid this.
I got it so far.
Absolute decoupling, you get that when the emissions of CO2, carbon dioxide, per dollar declines faster than the rate of economic growth. And so the per dollar amount of greenhouse gas emissions, depends what we're measuring here, declines faster than the economy grows, then in absolute terms, the emissions are going to reduce. And there is some evidence, some countries, some examples where we have seen that. However, climate change is not caused directly by the current emissions of carbon. It's caused by the accumulation of carbon in the atmosphere. And so you can still have a decline in absolute emissions, in total emissions year by year, but the cumulative amount of greenhouse gases, the concentration of greenhouse gases continues to rise and climate change gets worse. The only way to stop that from happening is to get to zero. It's not a maybe, it's a must be. If we keep adding in a net amount greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, climate change will get worse. So when we talk about decoupling, we must be clear which decoupling we're talking about. And,
Yes,
and unless
but not
we,
here. Yes,
unless
but
we,
that's where Ron and I will jump all over you, because it's not just a matter of getting it down to no emissions. It's also a matter of removing emissions that are already there.
fine.
That's why he
Well,
and I are pals, and I don't know about you guys. You know, my environmentalist friends are pretty suspect, and you might, I don't know what side you're on, but Ron and I may wind up on the different side on that issue, right?
No,
'Cause I
I'm
think we
sorry,
can.
you can't jump all over me on that, because I'm totally on side with you.
Oh,
But
good.
the latest estimates that I've seen are if we continue emitting carbon at the rate of 2023 last year, we have 7 years of accumulated emissions that would give us, that would still keep us within 1.5 degrees warming. So we have a carbon budget, a total amount that provides some estimate of what we can afford to put into the biosphere now, into the atmosphere. So we have a little bit of leeway, but the problem is, can we reduce our emissions to net zero or below, taking your point, within 7 years?
No, I don't think so.
So now, let me I know Ron's dying to talk, and I will stop in a moment. I don't want to suggest, though, that you solve this problem by saying, let's not grow the economy.
Yes.
That's not the way to think about it. You
Okay.
solve that problem by all sorts of changes in the way we live our lives, and your differentiation between the global north and global south is absolutely appropriate. All that's got to be looked at. The result of making, in many cases, positive changes to the way we live our lives can easily result in a lower rate of economic growth. So slower growth or negative economic growth will be in my estimation, the outcome of dealing with climate change and all of the other components of Earth overshoot. Ron, I must stop because you need to talk.
Well, now we're not so far apart, are we? Yes, Ron. Now I'm going to be quiet and let you take over.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Meta. Um, yes, I mean, I think perhaps we're not that far apart. We absolutely do need absolute decoupling. I mean, there's no question. In fact, we need to go negative, as Meta just pointed out, you know, by trillions of tons of GHG equivalent withdrawal in order to actually get some long-term restoration of a stable climate. Um, so my major concern about, and Peter, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but my major concern is I think I'm a radical economist, just so you know. I'm not. I'm a so-called heterodox economist. I believe York has quite a few of those, if my recollection is correct. But I am very focused on you know, before I got into the climate business full time, pretty much, I was very much a sort of class struggle, you know, redistribution, that kind of thing, and I believe that that's actually central to this issue because the developing countries desperately need growth. They need, you know, they need to be able to live in dignity and with an adequate standard of living, and that's the problem with the degrowth, you know, kind of slogan. I mean, you have a more nuanced version, but you know, at face value, people say, oh, you know, we have to live more simply, we have to cut back on consumption. Well, you know, tell that to the whatever it is, you know, the billions of people that are living in desperation and you know, lack of material and other, you know, essential services for human dignity. So I think that the question is really opposite. How do we get the kind of growth we desperately need to the countries that desperately need it while you know, drawing down our greenhouse gas emissions and removing greenhouse gases. And how do you do, you know, so that in essence, the long term barrier, the long-term problem we have, which is the greenhouse gas reduction and removal, the short-term thing is just cool. And that's where Meta and I are, you know, saying, you know, in the meantime, we need triage, we need a tourniquet to give us time. But there's no question that, you know, to give us time, the time is needed to have a fundamental transformation of human industrial civilization or human civilization toward a green economy, which is exactly as you described it, you know, with absolute decoupling. Uh, but the main barrier to that, actually, to doing that expeditiously, is the very evident inability for the rich countries and rich individuals of the world to transfer funding and technology at a rapid enough pace to facilitate that green transition where it's most needed, because those are the countries, you know, China, India, and so forth, that are going to be and are already the major emitters, the major greenhouse gas emitters, and they need to grow. And so, you know, you can't just tell them, you know, don't emit so much greenhouse gases unless they have a way to do that while at the same time providing increased material abundance for their populations. And I have an anecdote. I mean, Meta has heard this from me previously. You know, you have leaders such as the former president of Ecuador, who was very much an environmentalist. And during his tenure, they discovered oil reserves in the Amazon jungle in Ecuador, a very, very fertile region of the Amazon. You may be familiar with this. And he set up a fund, and he said, you know, I don't want to drill in the Amazon. So, you know, if the world will give me half of the money that my country is expected to generate from those oil reserves, I will not drill. And of course, nobody ponied up. You know, even that was just too much. So if you cannot, and I mean, subsequently, other, you know, Ecuador has, I think, they had some regulation, tried to reduce the impact, but they commenced drilling, and this is the problem that most of the I did a calculation that's something like 16 or 17% of the world population is over 1 point some billion people live in countries where over 10% of their export revenue, you know, foreign exchange earnings come from oil exports and related oil and related product exports. So, and that's $4 trillion. Just to replace that, that's not even all the investment and whatnot that's needed to have a transition to a green economy in those countries where they can produce something else that will generate those critical foreign exchange reserves. So it's not just, I mean, the majors, we can, and I fully agree, they need to change their practices. They need to become part of the solution and help us with the transition. And they are well placed to do that if they would just start really getting on, investing in hydrogen, investing in all kinds of green transition technologies. But the bigger problem is all those countries that depend, usually national oil companies that can be very corrupt, et cetera, but their primary export earnings. Mexico is another good example. The leftist president, he was a big proponent. He bought an oil refinery in Houston because he wanted to prop up Mexico's earnings from their oil. And you can see the problem. So unless we provide a pathway for even well-meaning leaders to be able to transition, and that pathway needs to be funding and technology and support from the rich countries and rich individuals, it's going to be very hard, particularly at a fast rate, at the kind of pace that you talked about. It's where I did a calculation. I think it was 3.2% a year. This was in 2022, I think, to get us to the 50% reduction that the IPCC has estimated is required to have a 66% chance of staying below 2.
It looks
Yeah.
like you guys really don't disagree much of it at all, which is wonderful, because then we can move on to talking about where, I mean, you're asking,
Can I just
what
interrupt
is the
you, Matt?
pathway?
Yeah.
Okay, now that's what I was thinking. Let's see what the qualifications are that Peter has about whether or not you're really in agreement. And if not, I mean, let's work on that. But then maybe we'll get around to talking about pathways. Peter.
Well, I'm not sure if Ron meant to imply that I was taking a position of telling poorer countries what they can and can't do, because I didn't say anything along those lines. But I understand the dilemma, and that is there, the way I would put it, is there the capacity of this planet to support the kind of population that we have globally at anything like the North American level of material standard of living? I don't think that it's not conceivable. So I'm quite attracted to the ethical principle of contraction and convergence, that those of us that are living way beyond the means of the planet to support all of us at that level, have to think about contraction. Now, that's contraction in the physical dimensions of our economy. There's the relationship between the physical, the amount of materials, the energy, the land that we use, and the way we measure the size of the economy in dollars is complicated. But there is a relationship. But it's clear to me that we cannot support everybody at the physical scale of the North American or European economies even, if we were all to live at that level. So those of us who are far above it need to contract, and that would allow the poorer countries who are below to converge. The level at which we might meet in the contraction and conversion that's compatible with the capacity of the planet to support us is unclear. And it's a nice researchable topic that more people should be looking at. But I do want to say this. What we should be doing in the rich countries is setting a different kind of example. How can we fault, and I think this was your point, how can we fault the poorer countries which want to try to emulate the living standards that they think that we have? Now, I say they think because, as you know, it's very unequally shared in the rich countries. But how can we tell them to do different things if we're setting such a terrible example, an example that cannot be followed by them? Now, when you talk about technology transfer, yes, there's a role for technology transfer, but it's not. These aren't the kind of problems that can be solved just through a different technology. Otherwise, why would we be in the problems that we're facing now? We've seen the most fantastic technological developments over the last 50 years where I've been watching and participating in what's going on. And the situation has not got better. If anything, it's got a lot worse. So my work And my rationale for it is to focus on my own country, Canada in particular. I take a close look at the US because what you guys do influences us. We are among the highest per capita emitters of greenhouse gases in the world. Our demand, and that's true of all of the other kinds of measures of human impact. We are the worst. We have to set a different example, and that means change has to come first and foremost in our countries. We can let the poorer countries make up their own minds about what they want to do. We can help them as the best we can in achieving their goals, but it's not for us to tell them what to do. It's for us to change our own ways first. And I think that's what we should be talking about today.
Okay. I think we've now reached some more specific points of disagreement. We'll see. So first of all, the main concern I have with what I understood from what you said is the emphasis on a sort of general emphasis on we have to reduce our greenhouse. And the problem as I see it is the upper 20% of the population. It's the 20% that generates 80% or more. This is Oxfam, and there are other data on this. By far, most of the greenhouse gas emissions are generated by the very top of the income distribution around the world, as I recall. So the issue is not, I think it would be better to frame it as we need to curb the excesses of those rich people that are, flying around in their private jets and doing this and, have 5 homes. And
sorry, Ron, it's wishful
let me
thinking.
finish, Peter. Let me finish. So I think, there's a class dimension here that gets lost when you tell people, we have to lead more simply, we have to cut growth. And it's also politically very difficult for working class people in the US. In the US, not everybody is living a great life, especially since we don't have universal health care and other things that you guys have. So, life is very, very difficult. And so, telling people that they need to cut, you get the kind of reaction you had in France with the yellow vest, oil tax. It's just not a very constructive message, in my view, to move forward. I think a much better message would be to say, yes, ordinary people, working class people, both in rich countries and especially in poor countries, need and deserve higher standards of living. They need access to basic human dignity and all that entails. And we need to curb the excesses. We need, in other words, very high taxes on and particularly carbon taxes and other kind of taxes that impact the upper tier of the income distribution that is generating most of the problem, both globally and nationally. And so I'm not really saying only technology, but clearly part of that money should go towards providing the technology and the funding for the poorer countries and the lower classes of people to have a better life around the world.
So Ron, listen, look, I agree with you that there's a serious inequality problem in pretty well every country now, but in the Western countries, particularly in the US, and to some degree in Canada. So we don't disagree on that. However, if you look at any of the calculations, say on the size of the ecological footprint, the demands that are placed by people at different income levels in the US or in Canada, if you take I don't want to use an average number because there are difficulties with that, but you've got to come a long way down the income scale before you get to a level that could be supported if everybody on the planet lived at that level. I mean, the problem we've got is not to be minimized.
With current technologies.
Well, I'm afraid
that becomes very important because
sorry, but we only have current technologies right now.
I know, but
and we have very urgent problems right now. It's all very well to say technology in the future, It hasn't solved the problems to this point. We can do a better job in the future, but I think whilst I appreciate your point of how difficult it is to try to persuade anybody to consume less, however you measure that. I understand that point. It's a huge political problem. I don't think it's properly answered by saying, well, let's not tell them what actually may well be true. Let's tell them there's a green economy out there, a green growth view of the world where somehow heading to 9 billion people will be able to live at a material standard of living. I don't know what level you think is supportable worldwide, but I mean, it's something like where Canada was in 1970,
Peter,
not 2025, 2024.
I think it would be a much better approach for us to take a page from the Messianic traditions of our culture and to say, and I actually I have this in my one of my papers on the renewable energy material economy. In order we have to get through Sinai. We have many years of transforming our civilization. That is going to be we have work to do, and frankly, we should ask the people who have the most to contribute the most to that. But eventually, the renewable economy, REMI. I took this from Peter Eisenberg, by the way, the renewable energy material economy, and I call it the transformation from the hunter gatherer industrial civilization to the farmer cultivator industrial civilization. The hunter gatherer refers to, you drill for the oil, you get the energy. Whoever finds the oil well, generates a windfall profits and becomes a rentier. And similarly for mining most of the material, minerals, and so forth. So it's all about discovering, capturing the windfall profits. And the industrial cultivator, you get the energy from the sun, abundant in most places on the planet, the wind. You can get energy also from, and in our other paper, the cooling paper, the OTEC, ocean. You can take the gradient of heat in the ocean and use that to generate energy and cool the planet at the same time. Hydrogen, use that to produce hydrogen. So there are ways. There's an abundance out there, a potential abundance in a green economy that potentially, I'm not saying it would be inevitable. It is potentially could lead to a more just and equitable society simply because it's much more available. You're producing, you're synthesizing a lot of the materials that we now mine, like substitutes for steel, substitutes for many, so all kinds of there's really exciting efforts going on in doing this. So that's the future, and you lay that out. People say, this is the hope. This is the promised land. This is where we potentially could go. So why don't we all work together to build that future, more prosperous and more just and more equitable society for our children, for our grandchildren.
Give Peter his chance.
Okay, so
that's a much better message than this.
But it's a false one. It's a false hope. Because first of all, whilst it's true that what we like to call renewable energy is free and abundant, the material requirements to capture it and use it are enormous. And this is already beginning to cause people a lot of concern. So if you imagine substituting all of the fossil fuel, nuclear powered electricity in North America with solar and wind, the material requirements for the wind turbines, for the photovoltaic collectors is enormous. I've done some calculations of this sort, and so have others. So that it's the technologically attractive future that you wish to say is out there for us to have. It may be there in the very long time if we can work out a way to get there. We have problems right now, and we have problems that are getting worse on an annual basis, even on a decade basis. The kind of transformations that are needed to get to net zero by 2050 themselves are dramatic. And if we can't do that, essentially with current technology, we are in big trouble.
Well, we agree on that.
Please,
I think Ben and I agree on that.
So
that,
if you know anything about, perhaps you do, about how long it takes to
yeah,
develop new
I've
technologies
done calculations.
and to get them widely used, it's very difficult. There are some really good writers. Vaclav Smil, you probably know his work, who talks about how long the different energy transitions that humanity has lived through have taken, is not very optimistic about making the kind of changes we need in the next 2, 3 decades if just relying on technology.
So,
Now, if
so
I'm just going to continue on
Peter,
in a
we
slight,
this is
no,
why we support a tourniquet. It's precisely for that
well, what
reason.
does that mean? What does a
It's a
tourniquet
tourniquet,
mean?
which means, we need to directly cool, keep things, try and avoid the situation from getting worse, as it will, if we don't apply a Band-Aid to the
What does that
bleeding
mean?
hurt
What does
right
that mean?
away, in order to give us time. And I agree, it's a very difficult process. It's going to take a long time. And that is exactly why we need some way to keep things under control in the meantime.
But that's got to mean a
What's that?
significant reduction. That's got to mean a significant reduction in the use of fossil fuels. You were criticizing
No,
me
direct.
for talking about having to reduce the material throughput and energy throughput in the economy, and yet
It's
isn't that
direct
what a
climate. It's direct cooling. It's not through GHG reduction. It's
But it surely it's
masking
both.
aerosols. It's pushing the heat down deeper into
So
the ocean.
this is geoengineering? This is
Yeah,
geoengineering.
basically,
Oh,
yeah.
well, if that's what you're going to rest your hopes on, good luck. I mean, there are so many problems with geoengineering. Who's going to design it? Who's going to control it? How are different countries
We
going to
need
make
another session,
decisions?
man.
Well, I mean, but let's not pretend to the
No,
audience that there's this,
Peter,
no, I'm going to speak now, that there's
go
this
ahead, go ahead,
magic
go ahead.
solution that can somehow buy us time so that we can develop all the technology we need and then we just sort of carry on with growth. I want to now give you a different perspective altogether
No,
no,
don't
listen, listen, no,
I need to
no,
just
no, no, no,
correct
you do
something,
not.
Peter.
Hey,
I'm going to
Ron,
continue
let
talking.
I'm
No,
not
Ron,
no, no, no,
saying,
let
it's my
no,
turn.
I'm absolutely supporting, we need absolutely to draw down, cut emissions as fast as possible. This is not a
So,
substitute.
so
It's not a
let me
substitute.
tell
It's
you a
a
bit about.
temporary, it's a Band-Aid. And in fact, it won't work if we don't cut rapidly and draw down rapidly. We can't cool forever.
Well,
Pinatubo cooled the planet for about a
okay,
year
I
and
don't
a
want
half
to.
by half a
It's enough.
degree.
It's enough.
We
You
can
use a
do
term like
simpler kinds of things
you
and
call
cool
Ron. You can't
temporarily.
call geoengineering a band-aid. A band-aid conjures up the idea of something very small. You buy them in a packet at
Okay,
your
tourniquet.
pharmacy and so on. A tourniquet is a little more serious. This is very
Okay,
short term. When you're
whatever.
talking about geoengineering, none of that language works. Now, I don't.
Direct climate
Let me
cooling.
hold it. Look, I don't just speculate idly about what's possible, what's not possible. A lot of my work over the last few years has been to develop a simulation model of the Canadian economy. It's the economy I know best, and to investigate possibilities starting from the present, not dreaming about the future, but starting from the present. How could the economy evolve so that the amount of materials and energy it used dropped dramatically, so that the ecological footprint of the country dropped dramatically without, as it turns out, a significant drop, not even a drop in the size of the economy measured in dollar terms, but an end of its growth. And I can show, and I have shown, it's in my latest book and papers, that we can simulate the economy, we can simulate the transition, what it means for investment in electrification of road and rail, what it means for the size of carbon tax that we would need, what it would mean. It includes redistribution of income towards the poor. You can put this package together empirically using real numbers. I'm sorry, I find your language about band-aids so misleading. It's really
Um,
difficult for me
uh,
to accept that. But the point is, we have to show what can be done starting here as we move into the next 4 or 5 decades, and we can see realistic possibilities. Now, what I want to say is this: you've
Peter,
described yourself as a radical economist. I try not to use these adjectives because it kind of pigeonholes you as if somehow you're the economist part's not legit. I don't go for that. But I we lack economists working hard on the problem of how do you transition an
Peter,
economy to
yeah,
something
I think
something that's not causing overshoot.
you're misfiring here.
No, I'm not.
I completely agree with you on
Ah,
everything you said. In fact, Simon Sharp, you may be familiar. I mean, they're folks who have not only done the studies, but also done the diplomatic work and efforts to get sectors to reduce, cut dramatically emissions at rates that we need, frankly, and much faster than those rates. And that's
fine.
great work. It's very important work, and I'm glad you're doing it. But on the issue of cooling, this is not, we have just had a paper just accepted for publication in Oxford Open Climate Change on the urgent need for direct climate cooling. We outlined 14 different methods, possibilities to do this. This is serious stuff. This is not,
Okay, Ron,
pie in the
just a minute.
sky
Now, Ron,
imagination.
just
And
a
we have
minute.
looked at the,
Just a
the
minute.
various arguments about the dangers of so it's not and it is not a substitute for any of the work that you're doing. It is simply we need to add it to our arsenal if we're going to have a realistic hope of getting to that promised land.
Ron, every Monday I have a show about cooling things. So we cover all of this in great detail, all the new technological things, all the various ways of repairing the climate. And there's no question we need to talk about that, and we do. But the interesting thing is both of you agree that in addition to the cooling with marine cloud brightening or cirrus cloud thinning or whatever, we also have to find ways of changing emissions. We have to do both. So I would like to listen to what Peter's proposing as the most promising places that we can make these changes. I mean, I've got a certain bug in my bonnet or certain things, and I go around every time my friends take a trip, a vacation abroad, I jump all over them for wasting all of that fuel for their airplanes or their cruises. And I need to know, for example, maybe that's not the right place I should criticize them. Maybe I should criticize them because they're not turning out the lights or something like that. I want to know what really makes a difference in terms of reducing emissions. And if Peter's working on that, I want to hear it. Peter.
Well, I don't recommend spending a lot of time criticizing your friends, by the way. Friends are valuable, and we're not going to solve this problem very much through that kind of mechanism. Look, there are things you can do at different scales. It's not uncommon when we're talking about environmental pressures that we pass regulations which limit certain activities. As you might not know this, Ron, but we have a large green belt around the city of Toronto. And it was put there specifically to try to contain urban sprawl, concentrate the city's growth within the area, and to preserve the best farmland we've got in the country. The provincial government promised that it would leave that intact if it was when it was running for office. When it became government, changed its mind and started to sell the land to developers. The public was up in arms and they had to backtrack. Now, this is an example where there was, if you like, a self-imposed limit on what people could do with their land for the sake of the public good. And it was widely accepted. When we knew we had an acid rain problem in the 80s, what did we do? We passed regulation. We said to the companies, it's a small number, which made it easier to deal with through regulation, that you have to limit, ultimately reduce to zero, your emissions of sulfur dioxide through your stacks. So what we're lacking, in my view, is a sufficiently comprehensive set of limits that we place on ourselves as human beings and on our institutions. In terms of what we take from nature and what we put back and how we transform the land area. So what we don't have that. You can point to sort of examples, as I've done, and there are many others. What we need is a comprehensive package which says if we're going to, well, to use your language, I won't say diathernicate, but put limits on what we allow ourselves to do, then we can move forward. Now, so what I would say to your friends, Meta, is these solutions are not achieved by individuals turning off the light bulbs. That stuff's all good, and we should do that. We should all live the lightest life on the planet that we can, but it requires political action. And the way you get that is by grouping with others, like-minded people, and pushing for that. Sadly, we live in a time in history where the direction we're moving, in my view, politically is quite wrong. It's just going to get worse. So it's bad news from that point of view, but I don't see an alternative to doing whatever we can do to develop a common sense of purpose, by which I mean, which requires some sort of shared understanding of our predicament and a common sense of the direction we should be going in, which you get, as we did to some significant degree during COVID, when all sorts of changes were accepted by people which would never under normal circumstances be accepted. That actually helped groups to build community, which is a very key part of the kind of change we want, and so on. So this is the way I would describe how we have to go. Now, in my simulation work, the things I tend to simulate are things which lend themselves to that, such as an increased rate of electrification of road and rail transport, an increased adoption of renewable energy technology. Of course, I'm a great supporter of that. I just don't think it's a universally applicable answer, not if we were going to keep continuing to expand the amount of electricity we want, and so on. Increased support to poorer people financially. It can be done, but it can't be done, in my view, in the context of continuing economic growth in rich countries.
Peter, let me just put some meat on. I mean, I fully agree with everything you said except that last sentence, maybe. that you know the you can't do that with economic growth. I mean, I think a lot depends on how you measure growth and what kind of growth and for who the growth is, and perhaps you agree with that as well. But in terms of the regulations or the limits, yes, absolutely. It's public policy that's absolutely essential to drive this at a rapid rate. I mean, the market can do things, but we need something much faster. So one of the examples that I've been using is the difference between the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Accord. A very simple example. Under Kyoto, there's about 300 plus billion was actually transferred through cap and trade through the clean development mechanism of the Kyoto Protocol. Most of it, is my understanding, went to China for various, and some of that was quite, sketchy. It was not, and there's been a lot of critique. Well, they used it to claim green emissions reduction credits from forests and so forth, and the forests would have grown anyway, and so forth, and then, that sort of thing. But some of it also went to, a lot of it went to developing wind in particular, and some of it for solar, in addition to, of course, a very large investment by China, also direct investments. In contrast, the Paris Accord said, no, this, we don't want any more of these mandatory treaties, and I have to say, the U.S. was was one of the major problems with all this. We're going to go to a voluntary agreement, nationally determined commitments, anyway, NDCs, and of course they haven't been able, and we're going to set up a green climate fund. So far, I think it's about 18 billion, and even that is much of that is loans and so forth. It's unclear how much of that is actually direct transfers. So one of the things, and I agree, on that national scale and regional scale, you need all kinds of compliance markets, you need public investment, you need all of these. You need to set up requirements to use green materials and green, building and so forth and so on. That will drive this transition, to expedite the transition. But on the international scale, which is, as I said before, the critical scale, if we want global reduction in emissions, we need to have, I think that, in my thinking anyway, that's the one example of a way to actually get significant transfers. I mean, 300 billion isn't even enough. The Green Climate Fund was targeted for 100 billion, which is totally, completely inadequate. 300 billion also. I mean, we need to be talking trillions. But to get that realistically, one of the mechanisms is through this kind of ability to cap and transfer, as Europe has done. Actually, Europe is the one region of the world, the major region of the world, where we've had actual significant reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. From 1990 to 2019, it was about 24% reduction. The U.S. went up by 2%. Now, the U.S. grew faster than Europe, but even if you take into account all that, both countries outsourced to China, of course, which is part of the way they cut emissions. But the U.S. manufacturing sector grew only about 7% more slowly than the USA. I have all this in my paper. So the example shows that to get significant cuts, this is absolutely, this kind of cap and trade system, and it could be monitored by requiring countries themselves to take responsibility for their targets. So not the individual contracts, which can have problems and they're hard to measure and so forth. But now with all the satellite data and other data, we can get a pretty good estimate of what emissions by country, in a large geographic area are, and use that to hold countries accountable. Say, you supposedly did all this emissions cutting through your cap and trade emissions. We want to see it. We want to see those cuts in your emissions. And so I think there are ways to do this that will achieve the transfer, the technology transfer, the funding transfer. Another example I use is the financial bailout, which of course is, again, this is much less likely politically, but the U.S. Federal Reserve was able to generate something around 29 trillion to bail out the central banks and basically the global financial system during the financial crash. If you use that over 30 years to help, to transform the world economy, just by creating the money, dollars, the world currency out of thin air and transferred it. It's a kind of modern monetary theory of
I'd like to hear
which is
Peter's
actually
response to what you're
Ministry for the
saying.
Future talks about that as well.
None of that really relates to this question, though, to my mind, of can we decouple carbon emissions fast enough from economic growth? Of
No, well,
course,
that's how you do it.
No, cap and trade can be very useful whether the economy is growing
You need
or not.
new technologies and new methods, and you need to fund that, and you need to invest in that.
But if you think you can do that and still have the rich countries growing at 2-3% a year, and the planet able to absorb all of the waste that will entail and supply all of the materials that will be required, I just don't think that's possible.
Well,
because we're already requiring 1.7 planets to support us if you use the ecological footprint as the measure. In other words, you compare the biocapacity of the planet against the demands we currently place on it. We're already 70%
Peter,
in excess of what the planet provides.
In more depth. It's the class situation is a major part of that. So if you redistributed that growth and it was actual growth that actually benefited people instead of luxury consumption, you could go a long way toward getting the kind of growth you need for the working class without
I understand that, but let me just
cutting
say,
living standards for everyone.
Look,
You want to cut
if everybody in the US had the average level of income that the US economy allows. Now, if everybody did, we would need something like 6 planets to support that.
If everybody in the world.
No, if everybody in the world lived at that level. Average American.
At current technologies, with current energy use, with all those caveats, and that's the real question. So I think
I agree with your concern about distribution. Don't get me wrong, and I agree with the need to transfer resources to poorer countries. Where I don't agree with you at all is that fundamentally, I hate to say this, you are a technological optimist, that you're saying out there lies a technological solution to our problems. And now you're focusing it on buying us time for several decades. But now, and during that time, we'll develop the technology. I think that that view is not sufficiently helpful. I would prefer to look at where are we
So,
now? What's the direction that we're on, the trajectory we're on? How do we change that trajectory? And we answered this question. You should be answering it for the US, not globally. I don't. I get nervous when I don't mean this personally. Don't get me wrong, but the idea of a global change, a change to our global environmental system, technologically engineered, probably led by Americans, scares the pants off me.
okay, well, I have some answers to that question, but on the other, you do a coalition of the willing. It's not, an American project. It's a space station, International Space Station like project. But anyway, on the issue of the technology, that the fact is that the population growth is slowing down. There are various trends that suggest that we will reach some kind of level where effectively we could have a steady state population of and we need, and so if we have a steady state population and we have a more equitable system where the people that need the growth are getting it and the people that don't need it are having to cough up a little bit more and reduce their extravagant lifestyles. I think it's perfectly so. So I would say, if we both agree on those things, then the question is, you're a little bit more pessimistic and I'm a little bit optimistic that you're right. But I mean, time
Can
will
I just,
tell.
Peter, I'm sorry, Ron, we're running out of time.
I think as a political message, it's much better to drive the message that we're both trying to get people to buy into. That is, we need to do something about this very, very severe problem. It's much better to drive it with hope rather than.
Oh,
and I don't see what
hold
I
it.
think
We're
there is
running out of
hope.
time.
It's not a false. It's not a false.
Look,
Ron, you need to let Peter speak more.
Okay, I'll shut up.
Hope is a good thing if it's grounded in what is essentially reasonable. I don't consider yet another promise of technology saving us as reasonable. So I do offer hope in the sense that I'm able to simulate a transition of the Canadian economy to one which is no longer growing in financial terms, but it's not poorer than it is today. In fact, it would even be a little richer because you've got to move to that period. But it would be a dramatic reduction in its physical and energetic requirements and waste production, including CO2. So that is very hopeful. The problem is we live in a world, North America in particular, which is addicted to growth, that everything you propose has to be tested against growth. You talked about population. Now, you're right, the population, the demographic projections now suggest that the world population will stabilize at about 9.5 billion. But the richer countries are already experiencing that. They see it as a problem. Why do they see it as a problem? Because they're saying, how can we have economic growth if we don't have an increasing labor force? So let's bring in people from poorer countries. So they're doing the very opposite of what you're talking about. This is not technology transfer to the poorer countries. This is human transfer to the richer countries, because who are the favored immigrants? The wealthy and the educated, and the nurses, the doctors, and so on. We're trying to bring them into Canada. You're trying to bring them into the US. This is obviously the wrong direction to go in. And so, how do we relieve ourselves of
sorry,
this?
Peter, but now you've got me puzzled. Why is it a bad thing to let immigrants into Canada?
It depends on our motivation. The biggest group of immigrants that we bring to this country are called economic immigrants. economic migrants, actually. We want them here to boost our economy. The government makes it absolutely plain that that's what it's for. Now, that is in order to secure economic growth. Instead of training enough people here, we take them often from the poorest countries. Now, this is another one of those issues.
Okay, now
that
if we
It
did,
depends. It's immigration policy. I mean, some countries
that is our
yeah,
immigration. Let me just,
favor
in a
skills
nutshell,
and
the
education.
immigration policy of Canada
Right.
is an economic growth policy.
Right.
I only mention that
in other
Meta,
countries as well. Yeah.
and other
But I
countries as well.
mean,
But look, I'm making the point that whilst we put economic growth at the top of our priorities for economic policy, and then political positioning and so on, it makes it almost impossible for us to move towards, and I'll use your term, Ron, a steady state economy where we have a stable population and a stable requirement for what nature can provide to us, and flourish as humans, because we spend our time in more leisure activities, in more social activities, and not the consumerist society that we live in at the moment. That's how I see an attractive future, and the poorer countries should be assisted with that. We shouldn't be controlling the flow of ideas and information through copyright and patent laws. We should be spreading ideas much more freely. There's lots we can do that, in fact, don't cost millions of dollars.
Peter, we have one more minute. Let me just one point here. So I come from the left, as is quite evident. I haven't been,
I don't think so. You're a technological
yeah, we're all lefties of some sort. So one of my I mean, I love Greta Thunberg and the radical activist climate people that, bless their hearts. They're really trying to ramp up the awareness and so forth, which is all great. But on the other hand, Greta, for example, I read her book. She says, well, we need a global revolution. We need all these, we need to stop spending, flying and doing all these things, and wasting, having all this wasteful consumption, greenhouse gas waste. I mean, the problem is that's not a practical solution within the coming decades. We're not going to have a democratic socialist revolution in the next few decades. Certainly not on a global scale. In fact, the more difficult things become, people become less generous, less altruistic. They want to set up border walls and so forth, and the world goes the other way. So the question is, how do we make that transition largely within our existing social and economic systems? And I don't see how you're going to get. I mean, it's capitalism is accumulate.
Well, that's
Moses, so that's a big problem here. It's not realistic, the degrowth idea in terms of our current economic system.
Yeah, okay.
It's not practical.
I think
in the near future.
Wow, we certainly could have some more time, but we don't. So I think this has been very stimulating. I need to go.
But I look. This is very frustrating, Meta, because the degrowth, which is a term I didn't use, the degrowth I'm talking about is reducing the physical scale of the economy. That is fundamental. Now, how we do that, you've got the idea of a temporary sort of stop to the what's happening with the global climate change, may not work. My concern is if you start putting a lot of emphasis on that, it will de-emphasize the other social and economic changes, which are much more fundamental for the long term. So maybe we disagreement about emphasis.
No. That's one of the major arguments, and it is an issue. It's true. Good. But we have to strictly decouple those things. We absolutely need emissions reductions and drawdown as fast as possible. There's no need to substitute. The cooling is actually, in terms of resources and whatnot, it's minuscule compared to what you need for the global transformation.
Okay, we've got to stop now.
There should be a trade-off.
We can't go on today. We have another session.
So,
I think there's somebody I wanted to bring in, and maybe if I can catch him, I'll have another session on this very topic because we're sure not through with it. It's clear. Thank you both. Now you can
Okay.
go
Thank you.
take
Thank
a
you all. Yeah.
breather and please relax.
Yeah, we're all fighting the good fight. It's all, yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank
I'm
you all.
glad I'm not an
Okay.
economist. I couldn't handle the nervous strain. Bye, guys.